Well, good evening, everybody. Lovely to see you all. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul Helliwell. I'm Executive Dean of the College of Health, Medicine and Life Sciences. I'm delighted to welcome you all here for this very special evening, the inaugural lecture of Professor Meriel Norris. And it's great to see colleagues, friends. I know there's lots of family members here as well. Not all of them. There's also people online. Welcome to you online as well. Just an important housekeeping announcement. Sorry to be boring, but if the fire alarm goes off, please exit, and you'll be directed where to go out of the building. Okay, we're not expecting a test this evening. Now, being appointed professor is obviously a very special achievement and recognises those who excel in their field. And I really, congratulate Meriel on this achievement. And we were reflecting earlier, when I started here in 2014, Meriel was a lecturer and she's progressed up the academic ladder. So I'm really pleased about that. Personally, I think I'm delighted that she's been able to meet all the requirements we set, and they're very high targets we set for our colleagues to achieve professorial status, and she's done it. So many congratulations. Now, for those of you who don't know Meriel, she qualified as a physiotherapist in 1993, and she's worked in the UK, India, and Indonesia, specialising in neurorehabilitation. And she joined Brunel in 2006 as a PhD student. She then finished her PhD and then moved on to a lectureship appointment in 2009. And she delivers expert and clinically relevant research-led teaching, predominantly postgraduate courses. She's the program lead for the MSc in Advanced Clinical Practice, the MSc Advanced Professional Practice, and the MSc Advanced Clinical Practice Apprenticeship Program. Meriel's an impressive research profile. She's published over 60 articles in peer-reviewed publications and presented at multiple national and international conferences, and she supervises a number of postgraduate students as well. She's also got a very impressive portfolio of research income. Now, next slide, I think. This is, we'll move on. Well, perhaps you could do that, you know what to do. It's not working.
No. Is there a technician in the room?
Technical issues.
It was working.
It was working. Well, it's a good job we tested it now, wasn't it?
Sorry, everyone online. Toby to the rescue. So I think there needs to... Oh, thank you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that
We're
is
not
working.
using that. Okay.
There we go.
Well,
Here
it's
we
going now. Okay. So we have a series of inaugural lectures. This is just to advertise the next one that's coming up. Another colleague from the College of Health, Medicine and Life Sciences, Vasil Gerganov, and he's giving a presentation, his inaugural lecture on the 15th of January. So I hope I've whetted your appetite for what promises to be a really entertaining lecture from Meriel. I'm going to stop now. At the end, there's opportunity for questions, and then there's also refreshments outside. So don't go on for too long. Okay? So I'm going to stop now. You've heard enough of me. I'm going to hand over to Meriel for her inaugural lecture at Brunel University, London. Congratulations, Meriel.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thank you all very much for spending your late afternoon, early evening here. It's really a pleasure to come and talk to you for what is quite a peculiar task, this lecture, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. One of the things about me is that I've done lots of things, and those things don't necessarily have an easy thread. And so this lecture has been quite a challenge for me to pull together, but I'm hoping I'm going to do it, and I hope in the way that I structure it, you'll both understand me, but you'll also understand what I profess. In other words, the values and the points that I think have been really important to direct my career and my research to date. But I should say that research is only one part of my job. And I say that because, as Paul mentioned, I have very many academic parts of my job. And I think it's really important that as a professor in a modern university, people understand that research is just part of the many, many different arms that we have to put in. But there are a couple of things that I need to say about this lecture. One is when I think of the word professor, I think of someone who's quite geeky and a specialist in their field and would do quite well in mastermind. That isn't me. And I certainly don't do the maths behind. No, it's absolutely fine. Okay, and so when I became a professor, I had a bit of a crisis, and I thought, what am I doing? What does this mean? And this has been a way, this lecture has been a way for me to try and pull what that means to me. And I thank Anne very much for prompting me to think about what it is I profess. So what you are getting today is, and now the clicker's not working again. I love a bit of technical issue. If I run over time, Paul, it's not my fault. There we go. Is a very clear statement that what you're getting today is me, is Professor Meriel Norris, which is a very, very peculiar thing because in my life, I have never done anything on my own. Everything I do is with other people from the day I was born to the rest of my career and the rest of my life. So before I do anything else, talking about what I've done, I'd like to just acknowledge a few of the people, and there's quite a few people who I've worked with, and that isn't the full list. But I just want to say for all the people I've worked with, for all the people who supported me, for my critical friends, for my non-critical friends who just give me a hug, can I thank you? Because without you, my research, my work wouldn't exist because I don't do it on my own. However, this is my inaugural lecture. Let's just remember that. So the stories I'm going to tell now are mine. If you don't like it, I'm sorry. I will tell the stories my way. So what am I going to do? Well, I better start at the beginning. This is kind of compulsory, and this is specifically for John Cossa. This was the last time I was on a bike before we started cycling to work about 5 years ago. I was born in Malaysia, and that's an important fact because being born in a country like Malaysia in the 1970s was an extraordinary kind of initiation to life. And it set a lot of things in motion for the rest of my life. Living with a whole host of people from many, many different countries, probably the best cuisine in the world. I apologize if I'm offending anyone. And some fantastic storms, which were always very exciting. And you'll see how that resonates as I talk through. But unsurprisingly, I was not on my own. And this is a very respectable picture of me with my siblings. That's me. I'm the youngest of 6. And that's me at the bottom in the front, looking particularly cute, I think. I could have put a number of photos up there, none of them very flattering to any of us, particularly as the 70s went on. But I decided not to do that. Now, my siblings, some of which are here, are quite extraordinary people, but they have never sat quiet for 40 minutes while I talk at them. So I'm going to milk this for as much as I possibly can. But of course, we were not alone. And that is an old picture of my mum and dad. And just to say that they look quite normal in that picture, they're not. They were the most eccentric and crazy people in the world. And so any peculiar behaviors I have, we definitely blame them. Okay, but they gave us all the opportunities in life to express ourselves and move forward. I'm going to quickly move forward. We came back to the UK. I went through my schooling, and for some unknown reason, I decided to become a physio. I know the reason. It's a very long lecture, so I'm not going to talk about that one. But I became a physio and I went up to Leeds and I studied with this crazy crew. And I've put both pictures up there because 30 years later, plus, we're still excellent friends. And if any of you worry about the state of the NHS, half of them are in charge. I'm not sure if that reassures or not, but they really are an extraordinary bunch. But then I came to Derby, worked as a physio, and believe it or not, I have no photographs of me ever in a physiotherapy uniform. So I just put my HCPC registration there, just so people do know that I did qualify as a physio, and I have worked as a physio in the UK. That's the background. That's kind of the stuff. What I want to talk about now is really where my journey properly began in my research and development. So here I'm sitting on what it is I want to profess. And I'm going to start with a little word about rehabilitation. My title is an odd one. I'm a professor of rehabilitation research and practice. Very, very important for me that the practice was in there. But I think I'd better define what I see rehabilitation to be, because I'm not your typical physio. And so it was important for me to frame that. I'll do that briefly. And then I want to try and pull on these 4 threads that have kind of underpinned the way I have gone about my career. So, what is rehabilitation? This isn't an easy thing to answer, so I'm just pulling on a couple of definitions in order to kind of throw out where my stance is. And I'm going to start with the WHO that talk about rehabilitation being a process whereby we facilitate independence in order to encourage participation and facilitate that as much as we can around the areas of recreation, work, education, and meaningful life roles, however somebody describes those. They go on to talk about the fact that there are many ways in which we can do it, such as addressing underlying health conditions and symptoms. Please remember that, I'm going to come back to that later. Supporting self-management, adapting tasks, modifying the environment, and assistive products. Now, any therapists in the room, or indeed anybody who's been through rehabilitation, may kind of suggest that that's a little bit old and a little bit limited. And 2 of the things that struck me very early on is that this model and this description doesn't talk about the people who deliver rehabilitation at all. And that for me is a really, really interesting area. The therapists, the medics, other people who are actually at the heart of delivery. But also, while it mentions family, it is quite an individualistic model. And my experience is that rehabilitation is never about the individual alone, and there's a whole other realm. And so that much broader realm, again, attracted my interest. I'm going to quickly introduce you to one more model, which I'll come back to later, which is the International Classification for Functioning. And here, they too talk about environmental and personal factors that influence the aims that we're trying to achieve in rehabilitation in that movement from the kind of independence to full participation. But again, my experience as a therapist is that these are often add-ons. And my experience in life is that these are not add-ons, that actually the social and the personal and the environmental factors are some of the most critical bits that actually direct how people engage with their rehabilitation. And I hope that will become clearer. So let's get on with thread number 1. And I want to talk about the nature of expertise and to start with my own and how that was challenged. So I'm going to go back to 1995, 2.5 years after I qualified, thinking that I knew about rehabilitation, thinking that I knew about physiotherapy. Off I went to India. And I went to a place called Gwalior, which is roughly where that red dot is, in the middle of, well, the top northern part of Madhya Pradesh. And it's an amazing city, it had about 1 million people there, and I was due to be there for 2 years. When I arrived, the colleagues I was working with bet that I would last a month. In total, I stayed 5.5 years in India. And in that 5.5 years, I learnt so much. There was something about coming out of my context that opened my eyes to things that became very relevant for my context here. So I'm going to just dwell on those a little bit because they really underpin other aspects of my work. So one of the things that I learned was that my expertise in the UK didn't translate very well. They had conditions that I'd never heard of. They had interactions with their family and society that I didn't understand. They had different ways of thinking about multiple different aspects, which I needed help to navigate. And many things I'd taken for granted in the UK, I could no longer take for granted. And so my eyes began to open and my own expertise was challenged. And what I found over the years that I was there is that actually if I had my ears opened and I listened to the stories of the people who were living there, then my expertise could be developed by listening to theirs and trying to understand theirs. So one of the things I really understood is that my biological knowledge, my knowledge of the anatomy, the physiology, the human systems and everything else was all well and good. But actually the people I was working with had very different ways of seeing the body. They understood actually the medical systems that we do. but they just also had other medical systems which influenced the way they thought of health, illness, and therefore how they would engage. This picture is a classic picture of Ayurveda, and that was one of the key influences. And what's so important with that is that they think about the physical body, but also your mental well-being. It mixes entirely with the mind, with your personality, but also with spiritual influences. And that concept of the body came into every part of life. How many mangoes I was eating was actually a point of conversation and several times that I was there, but also in how they engage with rehabilitation. And it became critical for me to understand that what I must do as a therapist is not educate them on my way of understanding how the body functions, as it might indicate in the WHO model, but actually understand theirs, that we can come together. And writers like Arthur Frank talk about this need to actually coalesce understanding from one place to another, so in fact they can come together and move forward. Absolute critical understanding that I had. The second was I lived in a family. This is my adoptive parents while I was there. And one of the things I also learned was that social interactions within families, cross-generational, were very complex. I was pretty ignorant when I went there of extended families, of religions, and the culture in general. And these all had quite substantial impacts on the way that people engage with rehabilitation. I'll leave that there because I'm going to pick it up later when I talk about my time in Indonesia. One of the very critical things that was very clear to me was the relevance of resources. I came from a country, the NHS, where if I needed surgery, I could get it. If I needed a walking aid, I could get it. As a therapist, I could choose to take and refer people for aids and appliances, and I would expect them to get it. That was not the case. People either couldn't get it, it wasn't suitable for their environment because the physical environment they were working in, or if they did, they had some very, very difficult choices to make. And it wasn't unusual for me to have conversations where I would be talking to the parents about, do you buy, because nothing was free at that point, do you buy the aid that this person needs, which is the same cost as the food for 5 members of that family for a week? What do you choose? Now, actually, these things are very real here, and many of my colleagues will know that. But it's actually when you go into these contexts that that reality really does shine at you and really holds you very strongly in terms of how you then kind of interact as a therapist later. But it also means you need to be creative. If you can't refer people for sitting, specialist seating for somebody who's unable to sit, you make it. And we made it out of papier-mâché. If you haven't got aids to help somebody keep their legs straight after surgery, you use a coconut branch and you strap them to that. There were all sorts of creativities that came out in that. And that problem-solving idea, again, has completely stuck with me. That ability that if you understand the principles of what you want to achieve, actually your imagination can do an awful lot more. But more than your imagination are the people that I worked with, because they had all of that intrinsic knowledge, and that creativity was part of their DNA. They helped me navigate this world, but also they helped me understand that my expertise did matter. I was ignorant of many things when I was there, but actually I understood the importance of the rigor of assessment. I understood professionalism, that everybody should be treated as an equal as they come into the clinic. And I also had a wicked sense of humor, and that went a long, long way. And what you'll see there is these are some of my colleagues in Gwalior and in the south who I'm still in contact with, and in Tamil Nadu in the far south, who I worked with in the fishing villages. That was India, extraordinary period of my life. And I came back and I thought, okay, I've got more questions and answers. So I did a master's in medical anthropology at SOAS. One of the most extraordinary years of my life. I came across philosophers who would help me think about power and the interactions within the medical systems that actually create as many issues as they do solve problems. I also came across other people like Meriel who made me totally rethink the way in which the body as lived is conceived within therapies. And I came out of that an entirely different woman. I've probably transformed myself as a human being every 3 or 4 years and hope that that continues. After that year, I went back to working clinically at St Mary's, and I stayed there until I finished as a clinical specialist in stroke. Neuro rehab had always been my love, and it gave me the scope to actually think about all of these interactive aspects that had come into my life with working with people who were trying to rebuild their lives after a very big change. But I also then had to move again, because in 2004, a huge tsunami and earthquake hit in Asia. And so early 2005, I shifted to Aceh, to Banda Aceh, and I worked there for several months in a post-conflict zone, but also post-disaster zone, supporting the rehabilitation effort. All of the lessons I learnt in India, my masters, my further years of experience with rehab, I thought this time I would know what I was doing. There were still lessons to learn. And I think the biggest lesson that I learnt here was about the balance between what we would consider as evidence-based practice and that balance with socially informed behaviours. And as one example, there was a young lady with a very complex fracture of her upper leg post the tsunami. And 3 months later, she was getting treatment locally by someone where she went without any anesthetic. They would refracture her leg and then they would set it with wood, herbs, and bandages. Up the road was an international relief hospital that could have done surgery free of charge. And the family didn't want to take her there. And as a therapist, this was a real challenge to me. I was taught that evidence-based practice was the way that you should go. The evidence would suggest that that would do a quicker healing time and therefore they would improve quicker. And yet here we were 3 months later and they were choosing not to. I spent quite a lot of time with that family to try and understand why, and it was very clear. They had been living in this conflict zone for a long period of time, and actually within the kind of aspects of that, trusting outside organizations was absolutely impossible. Trusting anybody outside your immediate sphere of influence was absolutely impossible. And as a young single female, they were not prepared to take their daughter, and she was not prepared to go into that environment. And so that was a real example where the social decision making, this isn't just theoretical, actually it really changes the choices that people make, and they have their reasons for making those choices. It also made me think very much about my role as a physio and that balance in evidence-based practice and how we work cross-culturally. And that led to the beginning of my academic career, because my first paper was to challenge myself about physiotherapy as a profession and the power that we potentially have, but also the potential consequences of trying to apply that power and those concepts without understanding the context in which you are in. My academic role has begun. And so we move on to thread 2. What a strange title for a neurophysio to be talking about. Never forget the second trombone. Well, those of you who do know me will know that I am a trombonist. Lapsed now. I do play a bit, but I used to play a lot when I was younger. But I never really went for it in terms of the main part. My main part was usually at the back. The second trombonist, quite happily playing in the back of the orchestra or the band. I did at one point think about being a musician, decided against that, and that's one of the reasons why I went into physio. But there is something about playing in an orchestra, and there is something about playing in that part of the orchestra that actually tells you everything about what you need to listen for in life. This is what I'm going to propose. And now we hand over to you. If this works, I'm going to play something, and I want you to guess what piece it is. Any guesses? Bolero, you're absolutely right. And the key thing about Bolero, you've picked that piece just from a very part of the rhythm, simple part of the rhythm, which goes the whole way through. Okay, who'd like to sing me the tune? Go on, someone have a go. Go on. Okay, can you all hear that? Should we see if she's right? Oh, when I knew you were going to have a go. Here we go. Very soft, but it was even in tune. Well done, ladies. Hey, so you can tell the rhythm, you can tell the tune. What does the second trombone play? Any idea? One note. Well, a few more than one, but not more. Sometimes, but not always. What's my point? My point is that we often, when we're listening to people's stories, can hear the underlying rhythm, the things that we hear again and again and again. We can often also hear the stories of their experience of rehabilitation when you're hearing the tune. But actually, there are many, many stories that are not either of those, but yet are at the beating heart of people's experiences of living with a disability, of rehabilitation. Let me play you a bit of that top line, which is what trombone does. So the second trombone plays on one, on two notes for about 8. It rests a bit, occasionally has a bit more on okay. But then we will fade off. But what's interesting with that pom-pomming is it sounds a little bit insignificant and you didn't know it. But at the end of the piece, that pom-pom becomes something quite different. Now, this might be quite loud. You ready? And what we've got is that transformation of what was a simple pom-pom with the glissando of the trombones to be the highlight, the pinnacle of that piece. And I think that says so much about when you listen to these stories that you haven't heard, you haven't noticed the second trombone in that piece before, but suddenly they can actually have a life and get you to hear something differently, get you to hear the piece differently. I bet you never listen to Bolero ever again in the same way because those pom-poms will be with you. And I think my main point here is that when we are listening to people's stories about rehabilitation, it is absolutely essential that we seek the stories behind the tune, behind the rhythm, and that we use methods to support that. And if that means taking little clips and breaking it down and have somebody do that, that's what we do. And then we allow those different stories to help us rethink an issue. And that is basically what I have been trying to do in my career, is be the second trombonist of the neurorehabilitation research world, which is a rather strange thing, but that's what I've tried to do. So I want to give you some examples of that. First of all is stories which broaden perspectives. And here I'm talking about ones that really open up voices we've not heard before. And when I did my PhD in very rural central Aceh, which was looking at stroke experience and health-seeking behavior, this was the first time that anybody had really been asking people with a stroke in that region what their experiences were and why they chose what they did. But let's extend that. That question hadn't been asked in Indonesia. In fact, that question hadn't really been asked in Southeast Asia. And in fact, the only place it really had outside of Western countries was 2 papers in South Africa. So these are voices that are basically silent in our research world about experience of stroke. And that for me is a problem because it means that we base our experiences on one perspective. Now, Takengan is an absolutely beautiful place, as you can see, but kind of environmentally quite challenging for people who may have interruptions with their physical capacity or cognitive capacity, but also it was the heart of the civil war that raged for 30 years in Indonesia And actually, what I discovered in my time there is that their way of understanding stroke was absolutely informed by how they understood the body in similar ways to India, how they interacted with their families, and the interdependence of a very small group, and therefore your ability to be able to contribute to that kind of unit was absolutely essential, but also about the threat and the fear that they had held. And many of them talked about the fact that the stress over the conflict time had been the cause of their stroke, and also that it was a way of disrupting some of the local spirits, which also impacted on them. Now, I'm not interested in right and wrong here. I'm interested in understanding how they thought what had happened to them had happened, because that directed what happened next. And that's why it's so important for us to understand that, in my view. And because this is an academic thing, of course, there's some papers talking about that. But when we look at what they did next, their rehabilitation pathway, they went everywhere. They saw a whole bunch of therapists and biomedical people, but they also saw lots of traditional therapists, often first, depending on their causation theories about their stroke. And they would also go to alternative, anything that they could that made sense to them, given their kind of experiences. While I was there, I spent a lot of time with those healers, having their treatments, trying to understand what they were doing and why they were doing it, and with the stroke survivors and their families to understand the steps they were taking and their reasons for it. Lo and behold, another medical paper. But that's quite a long way away. Fast forward a number of years, and one of my PhD students, Andrea Stennett, did some work looking at multiple sclerosis and physical activity. Quite a different change. But she found something similar, that people understood what was happening to them. They understood the concept of physical activity in a very particular way that was based on their own experience, and they responded to it based on that. And there was a paper about that, and I will come back to her work. So what does that mean in terms of how that drives my career forward or my thinking forward? Is this idea that stories are just stories, people's experiences are just experiences. But are they? Actually, when you really listen to them, they have the power to challenge our models that have been built from a certain story point, which is the story point of a small number of people on this planet. And actually, in this model, what we found was that these personal environmental factors themselves had a direct impact on how people conceived of the health condition itself, which is an arrow that doesn't exist on there. And therefore, in rehabilitation, we need to think about it. But what both myself and Andrea and many, many others have found is that actually these environmental and personal factors, which are an influence on these, are not a small influence. And in fact, in her work, she argued that from the testimonies of people living with multiple sclerosis, that in fact, these influences dictated their choices. And that often the kind of participation and activity was actually really dependent on what was happening down here. So these were no longer add-ons. And what she argued was that as a result of that, we needed to flip the ICF model in order to give these areas the prominence that they needed. And she wrote about that. Now I want to talk about stories which challenge focus and power. And on that, I will absolutely acknowledge my colleague, John, at the front here, but several other colleagues who are online who are listening to this. One of the great privileges, and I use that word quite carefully, of being an academic in my role is, and I'm looking at John, but I'm going to look away from John for a minute, is that I have had the privilege of being a program lead for several years. Okay, I was the program lead for the BSc course and now for some of the master's courses. It is a privilege. Our students are the lifeblood of what happens in rehabilitation, and we both learn with them but have the potential to influence them. But we also have a duty to ensure that their kind of education is fair and appropriate and incorporates all the aspects that they need to be successful in their career. And actually what we found as a yearly thing is that there were a group of students, well, two groups of students who just weren't quite doing so well. And every year we would see that. But the numbers were small and we didn't know what to do with it. Okay. And those were students mostly from racially minoritized backgrounds. And at Brunel, that's something we take very seriously. And so we began to look at that. And we started a number of little studies local to us to try and see whether there were any differences in placement marks, in other marks. And we found there probably were. We didn't try and hide that. We put it out there for people to talk about because nobody was talking about this. This, at that time, was information that people kind of knew, but nobody was putting in the public sphere. But it wasn't enough. And so with John and several other colleagues, a number of universities came together to get the biggest numbers we could, and we had a good look at the figures. These are the stories that data can tell. The numbers can tell us some stories. And the story that they told was actually there did seem to be a difference that privileged white students, and it was in specific areas. It also privileged students who weren't disabled. Now, that was an issue, big issue for us. And we were like, okay, but why? Numbers can tell us part of the story, but it can't tell us all of it. So with our colleagues, we went on and we actually asked students about the reasons why. And we heard a number of things. I won't go into detail with this, but the kind of stories that we heard challenged us as educators to think about that in our education and how we were actually looking at students and how they were being interacted with on placement. And when I think back to this, this was an incredibly involved piece of work that I think John would agree really challenged us as white middle class professionals to come out of our comfort zone and to listen very carefully. And one of the things we had to listen to from the students is, well, what are you doing with this information? We've done a lot of talking. What are you doing about it? I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But that was a challenge they posed to us rightly. And there were several other challenges on the way. Okay. The other kind of stories we need to talk about are stories that highlight what we still need to hear. And this is a really important part of academia that I think we underestimate, actually. We get involved in lots of different things, and we know that there are far too many questions in neurorehabilitation, for example, that we can never answer. But actually, by putting papers out there that go, we need to hear about the new aging populations, including people with disabilities, but also concepts that are becoming very, very widely used within healthcare, like self-management. And in neurorehabilitation, self-management is a very dominant concept, but actually has not really been, or at that time in 2013, had not been problematized. And so with my colleague Fiona, we actually put this paper out there to go, well, there's all of these questions still about it, and the research community needs to take these on. And so we put it out there. Thread number 3, it's not about you. And what I mean by that is it's not about me. Sorry, people online. It's not about me as the researcher. And this was really an area of me which is about methodology. I was always a qualitative researcher. I was always interested in listening to people's stories in multiple different ways, using creative methods, any way in which people would feel comfortable to share their story. But this turn is much more about who has the power in research. And that's what I want to talk about. Because we've done a number of projects, and again, a number of my colleagues here and online have been involved in these, where people's lived experience have been the reason to start the project. There was a huge piece of work we did with people who were living with stroke, where it was a stroke survivor who said, there's this organization called ARNI, they're doing something, does it work? And there was no literature. And so we started a project to see whether it worked. And that grew and it grew and it grew, and we amalgamated with Exeter, and we did full studies to answer that question that a service user asked. Questions that were important to them, no longer questions that I found interesting. That was not the reason. It came from the people whose work we were trying to, whose lives we were trying to impact. It was important to them. But also, it's not just about the beginning, it's the whole way through. And here it's about how people's lived experience can drive the project. I've loads of examples here. The work we're doing in Exeter with Parkinson's, people with Parkinson's and freezing. And again, some of my colleagues in Exeter are online. The work that we've done here on stroke, further multiple sclerosis that we've also done, and we are continuing to do at Brunel. But I'm going to pick on this and work with people with cerebral palsy, young people with cerebral palsy. And this area of work was really about looking at that transition from childhood to adult services and the problems that were there. It was an area identified by young people and their parents. They were on the research group, they were on the advisory committee. Every decision that was made in this project was with them. Every single decision that we made. There are loads of papers, but I'm not interested in the papers. What I'm interested in is the outputs that impact on their life. They said they wanted information so they could go to their GPs more informed. They worked with us to create some of that information. They said they wanted stuff about living with cerebral palsy and going through that transition that they could hear from other people with that condition who'd gone through it. We made digital stories with young people with cerebral palsy to do that. This project goes on, many other things, and at the end of it, they said, well, why hasn't this been more implemented in a formalized way? Ignition 2 came. They also highlighted that mental health was a significant area where they fell through the gap. Relate, CP, new projects specifically focused on the mental health, but all of that with and for the people. And that co-production, co-creation process has become much more important in the way that I work. Now, I know that that will be very familiar to some of my colleagues, particularly my social work colleagues at the back, that actually in physiotherapy particularly, we've been a bit slow on doing that. And actually, we're catching up. And others, like Cherry, have been doing that since their PhD, but we need to be doing more of that work. And I go back to the project that we did with our students. They challenged us with, what are you doing this information? We turned that round. We said, what would you like us to do with that information? And they were very clear. We want our voices out there. We want our voices out there to change people's minds, to help them understand our experience. They think about it differently. If we don't get that right with our students, how can we have that right with the future therapists who are going to be working in the world? And so we worked with them to create the tools to support this training. Now, the learning curve of that was huge. There were huge ethical dilemmas. How do we get their voice out there while keeping them safe in a profession that's actually quite closed? People would recognize them. We had to navigate that, and the team needed a lot of help to navigate that. But we also had to navigate this issue of the fact that the team was dominated by researchers who were also educators, but were white and middle class. And so we went to the young people, the students, and also experienced therapists from racially minoritized background and worked with them to co-create this. The challenges continued. We ensured that they were paid well. There were lots of significant issues with related trauma for them, reliving their own experiences of education. And every step of the way, we had to learn. By this point, I'm 20 years down my career and I'm 15 years into my academic career, and I am still learning from people's experiences. And that learning can often be very challenging to you as an individual, to me as an individual. And then I'm going to finish with thread 4, and I'm going to contradict myself. I've just said that at the heart of doing rehabilitation research, it needs to be about them. But in fact, it also needs to be about you as the researcher. But I'm also going to say you as a therapist when you're working as a therapist within rehabilitation. You make the decisions. You make the decisions about your methodological approach. As a clinician, you make the decisions about how you're going to interact and work with your client. That is your choice. Therefore, it is about you. And so that sense of who you are in the middle of all of this becomes really important. And I'm not talking about navel gazing and actually kind of going through a huge psychological process. I'm thinking here much more about you understanding yourself so you know what you are bringing to the table when you're working with others. Now, that sounds really obvious, but that was not a core part of my training. It's something I have learnt through 25 years of going through this process. There are different ways of doing this. In research, we've done this through a process of reflexivity, and anybody who does qualitative research will think about this. Very strong ways to think about what is going on, for example, when a woman who looks like that at nearly 6 foot is working with people from the community that actually have very, very different backgrounds. How do they see me? How do I see me? How do I see them? And what influences? And the paper is 9,000 words. Who has published a 9,000 word paper? That's got to be like the pinnacle of my career, that 9,000 words talking about me. Talking about actually how being nearly 6 foot in that context changed the research, because people used my body as a way to talk about their body. And I mean that literally. They pinched my legs, they pinched my arms, they slapped my thighs. Nobody told me that when I started my research career. But also the assumptions they made about me. The fact that I was 30-something and I didn't have children. This became a really kind of core interactive stuff that was half spoken and not spoken. There's just multiple things about who you are that impact, and that is no different to when you're a clinician. I move away from my research and I bring that to the point, and then I will finish, is that everything that we do in research has to come back to what we do as educators. And as a modern professor, I absolutely refuse to sit in just a research camp without bringing it to the so what of my everyday. I had a mission when I came at Brunel. I didn't tell anybody that, but I had a mission when I first started here that I wanted qualitative research to have equal footing within our courses to quantitative, because I believed it was important. We have it. But more than that, some of the principles of using reflexivity, and this is work that a colleague of mine created in a project that we did with students, we now use with students to help them think about themselves in their encounters with their patients. And actually that project told us very many things about how they felt that they could communicate better, they understood themselves better, and they thought their clinical reasoning was better as a result of knowing themselves better. So these things actually, they might come from very fancy words within research, working with people with neurological problems, but actually at the ground level, they have potential to impact on students. So we summarize. And definitely for you, where have you gone? I couldn't do it a year ago, so I'm going to do it now. My professings is always seek the second trombone. Find those voices that we're not hearing. Find methods to help go to them. It is not for them to come to us. It is for us to seek their voices and help them air them. Actively support inclusion and then create together, whatever that means, to create the answers to impact on their life. But the impact and the importance of their lived context, their expertise, becomes essential in understanding their rehabilitation journey, and for us as researchers, the journey that actually will help us kind of conceptualize and theorize rehabilitation as a process. Know your influence, know you, know what you bring to the table, always embrace challenge. That never goes away. I'm challenged standing here, and I will be challenged undoubtedly by some of the questions to come, so I might run away quite quickly. But lastly, I will say also, don't be afraid to put your finger in those pies. It was quite difficult for me at the beginning to pull this together because I've had such a weird career. But I think that weirdness brings strength. And with that strength means unusual perspectives that I think makes me, I'm saying this really confidently now, and don't repeat this back at me, actually perfect to be a professor of the future. We need our fingers in multiple pies. So let's embrace that. And with that, I thank you very much for listening.
Well, Meriel, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you. And I learned a lot in there as well. And there are lots of things about you that I didn't know as well. So that really, really good. captivating and really thought-provoking as well, actually. I mean, you've done a fantastic job. Thank you very much. You've kept us really entertained. Now, are you okay to have some questions?
It depends.
It depends. Okay. Well, let's open the floor to some questions. Anybody want to kick off? And we do have a microphone, and I'd like you to use it, please, if you are asking a question, because so people online can hear. I think it's going to connect. Oh, it's a green light now. Anybody want to ask anything? Right. Okay. Now, your hand was up first over there, and then we'll come to you. Do you want to just pass the microphone back? No, if you could do the microphone, and then we can, because people online won't be able to hear otherwise. Thank you.
So I'm just interested in what's next. What's your next track?
There's a short answer. There's a very long answer. I'll do the medium version. I mean, most of these projects are continuing. You know, the CP project is now developed and evolved. The stroke work is developing and evolved. The MS project, you know, they're all going. Their education project as well. But actually, I'm doing a bit of a turn. It's taken me very many years to feel confident, for lots of different reasons, to return back to Asia. I think that there is a very long story about that. A lot of it was just life circumstances. I got married, life, da-da-da-da-da. But also, as I learned more things, particularly through my masters, that power kind of issue of actually what it was to be a white academic working in a low middle income country became one of particular kind of conversation for myself. And I think I needed to sort out actually where I was comfortable in re-entering that zone. A lot of the work I'd done, I'd seen some practices that actually I did not want to be associated with and I was quite uncomfortable with. And I wanted to feel confident that actually my values and my principles in that work were welcomed and were appropriate. And the creativity that I had seen there could be part of the projects that I was working with. I'm hoping in February or March that myself and some colleagues will go over there, back to India. We've already started doing the groundwork, so I'm hoping. So a lot of it will stay the same, but I'm returning back to a certain extent to my homeland, but in a slightly different place. Maybe finally with that bit of expertise, or maybe not. But now I don't worry if that expertise is not mine. You know, it's okay, actually. The power doesn't have to be mine anymore. In fact, it shouldn't be.
Yes. Please.
Thank you, Meriel. Knowing you, I know this is so
Put the
authentic.
microphone a bit
It's just
closer. Sorry.
knowing
That's
you.
better. Yeah.
We'll have to be really close. This is really authentic, and it's very much you. But that's not my question. My question is, you showed us a picture there of all those pies. How do you decide which pies you go and say yes to and which pies you say no to?
Oh, John. Yeah, not fair. Well, if there's a custard pie, let's be fair. Anybody who knows me, if there's a custard pie, then that's the one I will always go to. No, you know, that's a really good question because I think sometimes a lot of the pies that I've stuck my finger in have been serendipity, and we underestimate that. Some of them have been conscious choices. Me coming back and doing my masters, which was a big fat pie, was a conscious choice. I threw myself into debt and I threw myself into my studies to try and help me kind of make sense of the world that I'd been living in. But actually, a lot of them haven't been. They've just been meeting people that have gone, well, what about doing it this way? Think about it that way. And also, when people have gone, what are you doing? That is not the right way to do it. And really challenge me. And I think those challenges are often the best way to be thinking about, I want to choose to go into a different pie because I have been directed to do so by people who I trust to critically engage with me as an academic and as a human being. So sometimes you fall into a pie and sometimes you choose to stick your fingers in.
Okay. Yeah, got another question. Right. Scylla over here.
Hi, Scylla.
Thank you. You talked about the physiotherapy students from underrepresented ethnic backgrounds not for some whatever reason being as successful. Have you managed to change that at all? And if so, how have you managed that? Because we're all keen to learn.
Yeah, grappling with that. I could have spent the whole lecture talking about that work because it's complex. The simple answer is that we've used the insights that we've got from the research to try and do things. as I said, very, very keen that research doesn't sit with the academic community, that it actually impacts on the people who need it to impact, which is our students. It's probably too early and too complex to say whether or not what we're trying to do has changed anything yet. But we have definitely put a number of steps, both locally, I mean, and kind of within Brunel, working very closely with our students in the same way that actually in OT they do as well, to try and use some of that information to work out how the big sense of that being part of physiotherapy, that they do belong within physiotherapy and they don't need to work so hard to belong, because actually we embrace them and we embrace what they bring, but also working with all of the students to understand the complexities of actually those interactions, and that they need to be mindful of that they don't use their privilege inappropriately. So that work, lots of work with staff and building their awareness. And I'm really privileged at Brunel because there are a number of key staff members who have taken their own areas and actually developed it with outreach work, with working with the student groups as well, multiple different ways. And then the national work that we've done, so that training package is available nationally, and that's about educators in practice. And we're using that. One of my colleagues has been using that in some of the clinical education programs that we run here, but also we've been working with NHS Trust to work with them in preceptorship to support their staff using that work package. We have a long way to go, and I think that John and others that I work with on this would say that we've probably been a bit gentle about it and a little bit kind of, we haven't shaken the tree quite enough, if that would be an appropriate way to do it. So we can't sit on our laurels with this. These issues are not going to suddenly disappear, and we need to be prepared to understand our role in perpetuating them and actually really challenge ourselves in that way.
Thank you, Meriel. Right, I'm going to ask you one question.
Oh,
so okay, and then we can finish up. And drinks are out there. So that's amazing. You've had a fantastic career. The things you've done. I mean, I'm just really sort of envious of those things that you talked about. So, what's your advice to students when they come through? You have a lot of interaction with students, but also to junior academic staff.
Well, students in physiotherapy, because that's where I work, is always about grow bigger than the constraints that we might impose on you. And that might sound a bit odd, but what I mean by that is we will talk to you in depth about anatomy and physiology and everything else, but that's not the human being. You know, that actually you need to think beyond that. And we're building more and more things in our curriculum to try and support that understanding of the lived body, of that experience of being that is so essential for them to actually be able to implement. And a lot of that comes with time. They're not going to, while they're learning their anatomy and physiology, they might not be able to embrace that. But if that message comes from us again and again and again and again in our teaching, and we can show that we're doing that as educators, then I believe that they will absorb that and take that into their work. So that's kind of a subtle way of doing it. More directly, we talk to them about it. We talk to them about a discrimination. We talk to them about the complexities. I mean, I haven't even begun to touch on that, but the complexities of what it is to touch another human being, and actually what that means and what that represents in what you do and how you touch and what does professional touch. There are many aspects of other bits of research we've done that we've now brought into that. And for new academics, well, other than embrace opportunity, serendipity really has, who I've been lucky enough to bump into and follow, has definitely been that. But I guess stay close to the people you are wanting to support. Your work is wanting to support. Stay close to them. They will teach you more than anything you ever read. You need to read those books. You need to read those articles. You need to stay absolutely up to date, but stay close and listen to the people whose lives you are trying to impact, because in that way you will be heading in the right direction. Even if you don't quite succeed in the first time, you'll be heading in the right direction, I think.
Excellent advice. Thank you very much. So, Meriel, fantastic. So it's over now, and you can relax. Okay, and join us all for drinks and nibbles outside. And thank you all for coming, and particularly thank you those online. And you can't join the drinks online.
No,
but I'm sure
go and
they'll
have a
raise
drink.
glass to you.
Go now, and I should have said actually right at the beginning, half the people online are in Vietnam, India, Indonesia, New Zealand, Australia. It's the middle of the night, and I did mean to tell them that they could fall asleep and snore because we wouldn't hear them. So it's time to wake up. Time to wake up, people.
Excellent. Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much for coming.